it's just wonderful to be a part of a grassroots effort of people who've dedicated themselves around the clock to think and participate in learning about genocide and racism and anti-Semitism and so on, and hopefully commit themselves to doing something as a result of this, or building on what they already know. So it's really a privilege to be a part of it, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much to our colleagues in Houston and in Spain, and in spirit with our friends in Brazil and Maria. What an incredible program. I can't wait to connect and learn more about this work and dream up ways that we can continue to support each other. It means a lot to have you in the coalition, to bring representation. All right, have a wonderful evening. All right, so that concludes our, 19 of the TWR Virtual Global Vigil that has been spanning the world for 24 hours. We are a few minutes early, which is great. I would love to welcome colleagues who are going to be joining us for our next session from Cincinnati and elsewhere to pop on. Let me see. Let me ask you to start your video. Some folks, as you came in, I stopped video because you were popping into the other program. So let's just go ahead and do that. Mark, I don't see your microphone activated, so you may have to reconnect. Sarah, come on in. And Jackie, let's see if we... Do we need to send Jackie the link? Let me get the link. In the meantime, can you guys come off of mute and we'll just test your audio and video really quick. Video's good, obviously. Hey, Jackie. Hi, Sarah. We hear you great. Alex, how about you? Can you come off mute?
Hello.
Hey, Sarah.
Hello.
Hey, Jackie, how about you?
Hello.
Hey, welcome. Great. So that means it's just Mark, and I see Mark is in here with just like that broken camera symbol, so we might need to just send a note to have him go out and come back. Or connect audio. Sarah, do you have Mark's phone number to text, or I can send an email? Okay, great, you got it. Thank you. Wonderful. All right, let me just double check this run of show. All right. Alex, welcome back. Is this your third part of the 24-hour vigil that you've been a part of?
Yes.
That's great. That's awesome. Here we have Mark. Great. Hi, Mark. Can you come off mute for a moment?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we got you. Perfect.
Okay. You want me to mute again, or?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
So this is a pretty straightforward session. We don't have too much fancy technology. Sarah, we will start focused on you with a spotlight, and then Alex with a artistic invocation and some name reading, and then we'll proceed with panel related things and a closing inspiration, and that should be it. Would y'all like to get started a little bit early? You'll have some extra time if you would like.
Fine with that. I'm ready to go whenever.
Great. Let's do it. Awesome. So I will disappear, and if you need me, just holler. But Sarah, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, David, and good evening, everyone, or good wherever you are, whatever time of day it is. It's an honor to be with you. My name is Sarah Weiss. I'm with the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center, which is located in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we are proud to be a part of the Together We Remember Coalition and together with my incredible colleagues for the 20th hour, I believe, of this global vigil. And tonight we gather certainly in solidarity and hope for a better future. And as we mark Genocide Awareness Month, we of course reflect on the work we have left to do that we'll talk about this evening. And we certainly had hoped that anti-Semitism would have magically disappeared when the gates of the camps closed, but unfortunately we know that at the end of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism didn't go away. And so tonight we'll be talking about the continued threat of anti-Semitism nationally, internationally, and not just to the Jewish community, but the threat it has to our ideals of pluralism and democracy and humanity, but also reflect on what we can do about it and create a better future together. But we're honored to start our vigil this evening with a Together We Remember fellow, Alex Fan, who will read the names of a few of those victims of identity-based violence here in America, and also start with an inspirational poem for us as we think about our work to do together. Alex?
Hello, my name is Alex Fan. I am from Bakersfield, California, land of the Tohono tribe. As we begin our program, I would like to start by lighting a candle in remembrance of the victims of identity-based violence. And I will be reading the names of victims of identity-based violence. Charleston Mother Emanuel shooting, Emanuel Church shooting, June 17th, 2015. 9 people were killed while worshiping at the Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, when a white supremacist opened fire. We remember Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Reverend Clementa C. Pickney, Tywanza Sanders, Reverend Daniel Simmons, Myra Thompson. Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue shooting, October 27th, 2018. A shooting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, killed 11 people at the synagogue that housed New Light, Dor Hadash, and Tree of Life congregations. We remember Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabanowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irving Younger. El Paso shooting, August 3rd, 2019. 22 people were killed in a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, when a gunman targeted members of the Latinx and immigrant communities. We remember Andre Ancondo, Jordan Ancondo, Arturo Benavides, Leonardo Campos, Maria Flores, Raúl Flores, Jorge Calvillo Garcia, Adolfo Ceros Hernandez, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juarez, Maria Eugenia Legarreta Roth, Elsa Mendoza Marquez, Maribel Loya, Ivan Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Margie Record, Sarah Esther Regalado, Javier Amir Rodriguez, Teresa Sanchez, Angie Inglesby, and Juan Velasquez. We remember these names and think of all those killed in acts of identity-based violence. I'm going to share a poem that Robert Lino wrote in response to the Pittsburgh Synagogue shooting. The poem was shared by the 1027 Healing Partnership, a Pittsburgh-based organization that fosters a sense of community well-being by providing opportunities for reflection, support, and connection for individuals and their loved ones impacted by the October 2018 attack and others who experience hate-induced trauma. I am holding on this long because I know Tomorrow will be better and brighter. For this much love we have for each other will grow into a mountain. It will be normal again. I am holding on this long because the pain we are going through is just like sowing seeds. For the harvest will be more joyous than the labor. So let us prepare to harvest this kindness together. I am holding on this long because no bad season lasts forever. Robert Leno.
Thank you, Alex, for reminding us of those victims, as well as offering us hope as we think about our work to do together. But also, Alex, thank you for your activism and advocacy as a youth fellow, and your commitment to ensuring that we learn from the past and continue to advocate for a better world for all. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it's up to all of us, of course, to live up to the sentiments in that powerful poem. And let us, as we dive into a topic that is challenging and talk about, unfortunately, the rise of anti-Semitism and how it's impacting us around the world. Let us hold those words of hope and optimism that this season won't last, and we will come upon a better season and brighter future. So to dive into our conversation about anti-Semitism and what we can do about it, I'm honored to be with two incredible colleagues who bring very distinct expertise to this conversation. One who's been working in the field for dozens of years internationally, and one who's working on a more grassroots local level in my own community, who I get to see work side by side every day. So let me introduce Mark Weitzman first, who to many may need no introduction. He is the Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He is a member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, IHRA, where he chaired the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial, and is currently chairing the Museums and Memorials Working Group. He was the architect of IHRA's adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism, which is the first formal definition and gave formal status. He is a participant in the program on religion and foreign policy of the Council on Foreign Relations, and served as a member of the advisory panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And he currently serves as the vice president of the Association of Holocaust Organizations. And Mr. Weitzman is co-editing the Routledge History of Anti-Semitism, scheduled for publication in 2021, and has chapters appearing in forthcoming volumes for Cambridge University Press and Indiana University Press. Mark, we're honored to have you with us this evening. He was also, let me tell you, the winner of the 2007 National Jewish Book Award for the Best Anthology for Anti-Semitism, The Generic Hatred, Essays in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal. And he also served as the historical advisor to the Marvel Comics graphic novel, X-Men Magneto Testament. So Mark, again, welcome, and we're honored to be with you and look forward to hearing more from you in just a moment. And maybe bring Mark on the screen so we can see him, and then I will introduce my colleague as well, Jackie Congedo. There she is, who is the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council here in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is in the Midwest, between New York and LA somewhere, and where there's a lot going on here in our community. In this role, she builds bridges between the Jewish and non-Jewish community and advocates on behalf of the Jewish community and Israel. She received a BA in journalism from the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism, where she graduated summa cum laude. And after graduation, she worked for 9 years as an award-winning reporter at television news stations in Washington, D.C., Lexington, Kentucky, in Cincinnati, Ohio, before she made the jump out of media into this work. And prior to her role as directing the Jewish Community Relations Council, she led public relations efforts for the Jewish Federation of Cincinnati and focusing on the work of the JCRC and in work around Israel. And I'll add that she is becoming nationally known for her unique approach to community relations, and specifically the need to approach our work in fighting anti-Semitism as a fight against extremism and a fight for pluralism and democracy. And so Jackie and Mark, thank you both for being with us. We're honored to have you. So we're going to dive into the conversation. We have a lot to cover in our time together. Jackie, I will start with you with the really simple topic of laying sort of the landscape of what you're seeing as it relates to anti-Semitism in America, sort of lay the groundwork for where things are and the sort of broad picture for us to start us off.
Thank you, Sarah and Mark. Just humbling to be with you both and on such an important topic, not just as you mentioned, Sarah, in the Jewish community, but really something that we all need to pay attention to as people who love the ideals of pluralism and understand that democracy really is, in some ways, the best protection that we have against extremist violence. So to answer your question, Sarah, about really the landscape in America, what we're seeing, I want to take a look at some of the data, which I think illustrates the trends here in a minute. But first, I want to keep in mind the trajectory and some of the historic markers that we witnessed recently, as I think that really sets the tone for where we are right now. So, for instance, the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was the first time in 300 years of American Jewish life that Jews were killed in their house of prayer. And it only took 6 months more, again, after 300 years of relatively safe worship in America, for this to happen again. So if we were to chart that, that's the kind of trajectory that serves as a sobering backdrop, really, for the kind of conversation we're having today. That being said, we can look at some of the numbers in two different ways. So we can look at the number of incidents, and actually the 2020 numbers on this just came out from the Anti-Defamation League, so I'm going to share a little bit of that. And also we can look at data that shows us how these trends are impacting Jews in the United States and their Jewish identity, how they feel about their Jewish identity. So first, as it relates to the number of incidents, actually we know that nationally anti-Semitic incidents declined by 4%. From what they were last year after hitting an all-time high last year. A lot of that can be attributed to the fact that we were all in our homes for much of the year this past year. But there were incidents reported in every state except Hawaii, North Dakota, and Wyoming in America. And the audit found that there were on average nearly 6 anti-Semitic incidents in the United States each day. Also, to put this in context, the Southern Poverty Law Center tracks hate groups, and they publish a map that shows where different hate extremist movements are across the United States. The map has a legend that denotes different types of hate groups, everything from anti-government to white nationalist, anti-LGBTQ, anti-immigrant, etc. They actually don't have a symbol for anti-Semitic hate groups, and in their words, this is because they all are anti-Semitic in nature. They all share this sort of commonality, this common hatred, and some of these common anti-Semitic sort of roots. And so we're going to look a little bit more at that in a minute. Recently, many may have heard, certainly across the world, around the world, about very high-profile, explicit cases of anti-Semitism, including some of the rhetoric in Charlottesville, the neo-Nazi rally march in Charlottesville. Jews will not replace us, if you remember, was what they were chanting as they were carrying those torches. Some of the anti-Semitic imagery on display recently at the Capitol, the insurgency at the U.S. Capitol. Pictures of people wearing Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts. And other anti-Semitic sort of rhetoric and imagery associated with some of the movements that were present that day. And also we've seen it, unfortunately, in some of the highest, spaces in government. Recently, a sitting member of Congress was stripped of her committee assignments for some rhetoric that she used prior to being in office, sort of insinuating that somehow Jewish space lasers were to blame for wildfires in America. So unfortunately, this is no longer something I think that we can say is confined to the fringes. And I'll go a little bit more into the numbers, so which I think illustrates some of the trends as it relates to COVID. In 2020, there were more than 300 reported incidents at Jewish institutions. That's an increase of 40% from 2019. And of the 264, so most of those were incidents of harassment, and most of those incidents of harassment were incidents of Zoom bombings. So this is this trend during COVID of people interrupting online meetings or services with anti-Semitic imagery and language. And we've seen sort of an explosion of that in COVID. Also, we know from the data that in January and February, so really before the shutdowns, anti-Semitic incidents in schools were reported at significantly higher levels than they were during the same period in 2019. But of course, that trend dropped dramatically as institutions, educational institutions, switched to remote learning. So going beyond the numbers to characterize what this looks like, this shows up across the political spectrum. And in other spaces in American society as well. On the right, certainly in terms of historic manifestations of anti-Semitism, Nazi ideology, rhetoric. And on the left, where Jews are really denied their identity as a group that has faced marginalization because they're perceived as white, even though we know that there is a strong representation of Jews of color in America. And also where Israel is treated as sort of the Jew among nations and sort of singled out exclusively. This, again, separate from criticism of Israeli policy or politicians. And of course, Mark, an expert on some of these topics, and I'm sure may be able to share more. We know those kinds of criticism are healthy in a democratic society, legitimate. We're really talking more about action or rhetoric that delegitimizes, demonizes Israel, or somehow holds Israel to a double standard. Also, I want to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism and the white nationalist movement, which is something that we're seeing in America. We talk a lot with civil rights activist Eric Ward, who's written extensively on this at the Western State Center, being that anti-Semitism is actually what animates, in many ways, white nationalism. In other words, white nationalists attribute the successes of progressive rights movements, namely Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ movements, etc., to, again, this maniacal Jew who is somehow using their, what they would say, white positioning to pull the levers behind the scenes and upend the superiority of the white race. Of course, this is nothing more than a dangerous conspiracy. There's no truth to this. It goes without saying. And, it also dehumanizes and really strips the legitimate wins of people of color and other people with other identities who are due the credit for some of these civil rights victories. Lastly, I'll just share a little bit about attitudes from American Jews among American Jews. So the American Jewish Committee surveys American Jews every year. This past year, we know that 1/3 of respondents said that they avoid certain places, events, situations out of concern for their safety. 1/3 have taken steps to conceal their Jewishness in public. And almost 1/3, 27%, said that Jewish institutions that they're affiliated with have been the targets of anti-Semitism in the 2 years since the Pittsburgh attack. So, unfortunately, this is a persistent hatred that mutates. Deborah Lipstadt, has called it a virus because it behaves like a virus. And we know that we are now just seeing the most recent mutations and manifestations of something that has been around for a long time, and unfortunately may be around for a long time. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to understand that that anti-Semitism, much like many other hatreds, is really a foundational threat to the freedoms that we all enjoy as people who, again, relish the ideals of pluralism and democracy. And that when we see anti-Semitism spiking, particularly when it migrates from the fringes to the center, and when it starts to really inform more of the mainstream conversation and really be part of the mainstream, that's an indicator that there is something that's happening in terms of a brokenness in our democracy, that our discourse is decaying, that our ability to work together is falling apart. And so that's something we all need to pay attention to, again, as people who are invested in the great American and otherwise experiment of democratic governance and the freedoms that protects. So I'll stop there for now, but I'm sure more to come later.
Jackie, thank you for covering so much in such a short time. We're going to dig in actually more of that in just a moment. But Mark, let's sort of turn to you and take kind of a global view now. Is what Jackie just described, how would you describe sort of what's happening globally and your sense of that?
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, thank you for the invitation to join and really be a part of this extraordinarily significant effort. It's so exciting because I think this is in some ways the first step or one of the primary goals of people who work in this field to sort of catalyze, I don't know, maybe just created a word there, people's involvement. But it's just wonderful to be a part of a grassroots effort of people who've dedicated themselves around the clock to think and participate in learning about genocide and racism and anti-Semitism and so on, and hopefully commit themselves to doing something as a result of this or building on what they already know. So it's really a privilege to be a part of it, and thank you for the opportunity. And participate with Jackie. I've heard so many wonderful things about it and the efforts that she's doing in Cincinnati. Certainly, as you said, it merited national attention. So it's just awesome to be on the same virtual panel as well. I want to build, if I may, on what Jackie said, because you framed the question to me in terms of global. In one sense, I'll say everything is global, nothing is global, but we're certainly in a world where globalization has become a key element, a key theme. And in some ways, it's impossible to divorce what is happening. We all know Tip O'Neill famously said, all politics is local. And there are certainly local and significant and distinctive elements to anti-Semitism, as with anything else on the national and international level. But there are certainly themes as well that connect and link together. And I want to try to take both paths, explore a little bit of both, and kind of open up a window and a picture. To begin with, I want to sort of look at some of the differences between Europe and the United States historically in terms of anti-Semitism, because we've grown up in a country that has tremendous flaws and tremendous problems, and some of them are finally coming out to the open today, and we're dealing with all sorts of issues of memory and history, of racism and structuralism and so on. And yet, on the other hand, Europe has a whole different set of concerns and issues and background. And even though the themes and the issues that they're dealing with are resonant, in some cases, the exact same as the US, for us to understand what's going on there, we have to understand the differences as well. So to begin with, in the United States, for example, or let me put it this way, in Europe, there's a different history of anti-Semitism, perhaps because of the history of European countries with state religions that required adherence to a dominant religion that was linked to the government, whether it was royalty, whether it was post 1848 and the revolutionary period, whether it was a more form of democratic or quasi-democratic government. The dominant religion in European countries has had very often secular impact and secular power. In the United States, we've had unofficial state religions. I'm certainly not going to say that there's no connection and no influence and so on, but we never had the established singular state religion wielding that kind of power. And I think that plays out because in the European history of anti-Semitism is rife with expulsions, with violence, with pogroms, ultimately leading to genocide of Jews. In the United States, we have not had that. We have certainly had violence against Jews, but it has been limited in certain ways up until the past couple of years. The explosion of violence that Jackie mentioned and highlighted, Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City, etc., all stood out precisely because they were historical anomalies. Instead of progressing, we had now gone backwards in terms of violent anti-Semitism in our country. But they were not unheard of. And it doesn't take looking at the lynching of Leo Frank in the 1920s, for example, because if we go back, and sometimes we have short-term memory loss, we just have to go back to the 80s and 90s, where there's a series of extremist groups, neo-Nazi groups, the Order and others like that, who orchestrated a string of murders, whether it was the radio talk show host Alan Berg in Denver in 1984, whether it was a number of others, Buford Furrow at the JCC in Los Angeles, or the JCC in Seattle, or a series of or murder of an Orthodox Jew in Pittsburgh, or even James Van Braun, who walked into the Holocaust Museum in Washington in 2000 and murdered an African-American guard there, and even in sort of your neck of the woods, I'm speaking from New York, but nearby, starting in Indiana, then going up to Chicago, Benjamin Smith from the World Church of the Creator, a series of shootings, of drive-by shootings, wounding some Jews, and killing an African-American basketball coach, Asian Americans. All these were linked to what that loose, violent underground movement that we associated with the militias and some of the other anti-government groups of the 1980s, 90s. And we thought that we had sort of put them behind in 2000 or so. These groups were the ones who literally declared their independence from the United States government, called the United States government Zog, Zionist occupied government, and declared war on the United States government officially. And we see those ideologies and some of those same figures resurfacing and playing out in today's extremist world. It is not so different from QAnon and Adam Boffin and some of the other groups that we're dealing with. So this history in the United States of violent anti-Semitism, we have to recognize that it was always there, but it was limited to the fringes, but it was always there. In the mainstream, of course, we had much more prevalent anti-Semitism in the United States, whether it was the, as I said, I'm from New York, Peter Stuyvesant, the man who's credited with creating or establishing New York City, was a virulent anti-Semite, a racist slave trader on the side, by the way, I should say equally important, whose name graces high schools and neighborhoods and so on in New York. And he wrote his bosses in New Amsterdam in 1654, trying to keep Jews out of even settling in New Amsterdam. As we know, somehow or other, we persevered, and there are more than a few Jews who can vouch for that in New York City today. But this was written in all the way through Henry Ford introducing industrialized anti-Semitism and Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the 1920s, and Charles Coughlin in the 30s and early 1940s and so on. Their anti-Semitism has never been far from the, or I should say it's rooted in the fabric of American society. But at the same time, we had a counterbalance, and that was not present in Europe really in the same way. We had George Washington's famous letter to the Truro Synagogue, in which he established the basic tenets of freedom of religion, particularly in regard to Jews. We had President Lincoln revoking General Sherman, General Grant's famous expulsion order very quickly. And Jews, as we know, flourished in the United States. In Europe, really, that kind of counter pressure never really took pressure. Jews were grudgingly admitted back into the country they were expelled for. They were grudgingly admitted into societies. There is an historian in Hungary today, a woman who is one of President Orban's prime ideologues, let's say, who is in charge of a Holocaust institution and memory institutions in there, who has written, for example, that the bargain that was made in the 19th century to allow Hungarian Jews into society was that they'd be allowed to prosper financially, economically, they could join the professional classes, but they could never join the governing classes, the military, the elite, and so on, the nobility. That was, if they did that, then they would be responsible for whatever happened to them. In other words, it justified Jews were the justifiers of anti-Semitism by these actions. Obviously, the Nazi ideology, we know the history of collaboration in Europe. We know the bedrock of anti-Semitism they drew upon, whether it was in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, or France, or the Benelux countries. They did not and could not have achieved their goals, the genocide of the Jews, by themselves. They found willing accomplices. That was there beforehand. Those accomplices did not create the final solution. They didn't draw up the plans for the gas chambers, et cetera, et cetera. But those individuals who participated did so willingly. The scholars have found that essentially those who wanted to withdraw from the killing process were not punished, for the most part, by the Nazis. They had that window if they wanted to avail themselves of it. Few actually did. So the histories diverge in that way. And in Europe today, that legacy of hate is now augmented by the role of radical Islam, which has found so many willing adherents in younger generation of Muslims who have not been welcomed in Europe, are facing issues of racial and religious bigotry and unacceptance as well. And there are many communities in Europe where you see a distinction between the older generation and the younger who have been radicalized, particularly through the internet and through local mosques. And this plays out over and over and over again in situations where most of the violence, unlike the United States, anti-Semitic violence in Europe over the past few years has been based in radical Islamist circles. Most of the violence in the United States, actually pretty much all the anti-Semitic hardcore violence in the United States, with the exception perhaps of Jersey City, was at the feet of domestic violent extremists. So there is a significant difference there. But I also have to stress that the connection between Europe and the United States is strong, even in the radical extremist right in the United States. We have put a veneer of, they have put a veneer of local issues, whether it's state government or COVID, public health measures or whatever, onto their actions. But so much of their stuff, ideologically and practically, is connected to Europe. Jackie made mention of the slogan in Charlottesville, "Jews will not replace us." This was a slogan that the same congresswoman that she referred to actually used as well, similar thought, blaming Jews for pushing out the white majority of Europe in an earlier posting before she was elected to Congress. And it is actually comes from a French far-right philosopher, let's call him, Renard Camus, who's the father of the replacement theory, the great replacement theory, and that's what that's based on. So the ideology flows in many cases from Europe. We have groups in the United States, Adam Boffin, et cetera, who were connected to European far-right radical neo-Nazi groups and did training there, Azov Battalion, Nordic Resistance Movement, et cetera. And they've gone over from the United States to Europe, done this tour, and come back and brought their practical training on top of what they've gotten from US military training to augment that and to prepare for the coming race war, the great acceleration theory, which is that you push and push and push, destabilize society in the United States until you create the conditions for a race war, civil war, which is ultimately what they want. And that again links racist theory to anti-Semitism. That quote of the SPLC is absolutely right on target. For these groups, anti-Semitism is foundational and racism is an integral part of their ideology as well. So what we have in Europe now is a situation where, and I'm going to not try to bring in too many statistics or anything like that, but the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is the human rights agency of the European Union, has done something pretty interesting. They actually went and surveyed Jews in Europe of how they feel of the situation. And they've done 2 of these, and of the 13 largest, I think, Jewish communities in Europe. And without going into detail, I can just tell you that most Jews in Europe today are afraid of showing their Jewish identity, hide it to the best of their ability, are afraid to report incidents to the police and so on, the authorities. These incidents, that the percentage of incidents are tremendously underreported there, and are contemplating or have contemplated immigration. So in essence, to draw a very stark picture, and I'll conclude with this because it's a very depressing picture as well. If the Nazis try to create a European continent free of Jews, Judenrein, which is their stated goal, and did not achieve that, the current conditions have made it possible, for example, for a former vice president of the European Union, Franz Timmermans, to say that he can now conceive of a Europe without Jews, of a continent where Jews feel so unwelcome and so threatened that they will voluntarily depart. And that is a terrifying image that we're trying to counter.
So on that depressing note, thank you, Mark.
Sorry.
In a moment, we'll move to what
we'll get to the optimistic part.
Yeah, I might jump us there faster, but no. Actually, I want to dive back in for just a moment and then go forward, Jackie. Just on the numbers, and Mark, you can weigh in on this too. You just mentioned the ADL report that came out yesterday, and you've seen trending up according to ADL statistics. Also, FBI hate crimes, which are different than what the ADL reports. But is there more? Mark, you were reminding us of, this isn't new, right? Is there more, or is there more reporting, or is it a little bit of both? I don't know.
From my perspective, I don't know who's going first. Jackie, you want to go first?
No, Mark, you take this one first.
From my perspective, the answer is yes to both of those. There is more. We have never seen this kind of violence, as Jackie pointed out quite accurately, on a level in the United States before. Of course, everything now is reported, everything's available online, and you get more information. We will, and those of us in the field, I think, all know that hate crime statistics are generally underreported. If you turn to the authorities, to the FBI statistics or local statistics, there are all sorts of reasons for that, but they represent the proverbial tip of the iceberg. I can't say exactly how far down that iceberg goes, but they're considered the baseline to start with, not the final sum total. The ADL report was interesting because I believe, as they pointed out, that it showed, I think, a 4% decrease, Jackie, you mentioned, was we have to factor in that was a period where the country was essentially locked down. So people were not supposedly, theoretically at least, out and about with the same freedom that they did before. So in a period where the lockdown supposedly is in effect, it should have declined dramatically, one would think, and yet it didn't. And if we go to Austria, the statistics there in the same period show a great jump in anti-Semitic incidents, even during the lockdown, which is extremely bizarre. I mean, do you draw the conclusion that anti-Semites are the ones running around in defiance of the lockdown, or you just try to factor that out? And I'm not sure if any of us have an answer to that yet, if there's any correlation. But it's again, it's not a good indicator of I would say that statistics are not the best indicator of total reliability, but they point a direction. They can point to a trend.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And, it gives a glimpse into what we're looking at. And from a trend standpoint, as Mark said, the other interesting thing I was reflecting about COVID is while there were all of these, lockdown measures in place and people weren't out and about sort of in their normal public lives, in some ways, so much about the pandemic has created a space where, sort of a petri dish for anti-Semitism, right? And for other kinds of scapegoating. And we've seen this in anti-Asian, hate crime. We've seen this in anti-immigrant hate crime, this idea that somehow outsiders are infecting or bringing in. We've all been locked in our homes where in our bubbles, in our confirmation bias, where we're not out and about interacting with other people. And we know that's the best way to deal and address stereotypes, right? Is to actually be in community with other people and get to know them. The other thing about COVID is this climate of scarcity, right? And anytime people feel marginalized, like there's either perceived or actual scarcity in the environment, again, people look for someone to blame for that. And sort of Jews is a natural place for people to go, building upon sort of historic anti-Semitism associated, Jews having been blamed for plagues throughout millennia, right? I mean, this is not a new thing. We saw in Ohio, in some of the protests outside the State House during the shutdowns, a man holding a sign that had a rat on it with a Jewish star and a yarmulke. And the sign said the real plague. And actually this guy went on to a couple weeks later, he went in armed with a machete and all kinds of neo-Nazi insignia, on his clothing, into a convenience store near Kent State, right around the anniversary of the Kent State shootings, and was asking where he could find Jews. So this guy is now, away in jail, serving a sentence for actually an unrelated charge, thanks to the cooperation of lots of different organizations. But it just goes to show you that I think the pandemic has brought out the worst in a lot of people, and it's brought people who have these explicit anti-Semitic, racist, bigoted ideas into a space where they can actually blend their narratives and find common cause with people who just feel disenfranchised or are tired of being locked at home, or are, in the case of what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, who feel that, somehow the election was rigged, or there was a stolen election. So people who have ideas or concerns or fears that aren't anti-Semitic in nature are now in spaces where these things are merging. And, you throw conspiracy theory and sort of the traction that movements like QAnon and others have gotten in this environment on top of that, and you think about the fact that anti-Semitism is at its core a conspiracy theory, And some of these numbers, the fact that, as you said, Mark, in 2020, you would expect if we were all locked in our houses for anti-Semitic numbers to be way lower than 4% less than, the highest number on record. We would expect them to be like, where is the anti-Semitism when we're all locked in our houses? Well, actually, in some ways, it's really it's really brought it out in much more, in many other ways, and sort of tied to what the pandemic has unearthed.
So we've been talking about anti-Semitism and how it's playing out in the US and Europe and historically and all of these things. But I know something that's sort of challenging. We get questions about all the time, or people don't even know, like, how do you even, seems weird, a weird question, not what's the definition, but how do you identify anti-Semitism, or how do you know what it is or isn't? And how does it differ from other forms of hatred? I know that's a big question in a little time, but I don't know. Jackie, if you want to lead us off.
Yeah, sure. So I'll say, first of all, why I think we have this challenge in America in particular, and this is, again, in just particularly the American context. It seems, by the numbers that this would be, if you've been listening to the conversation over the last half hour, it's pretty clear that we have a problem in America. But it's actually a challenge to identify, because anti-Semitism is not so easy, as you said, Sarah, to detect sometimes. And it's often trafficked in dog whistles and more nuanced forms, like any other form of hatred or bigotry can be. And so we really are faced in America with this contradiction, right? Where on one hand, Jews are, if you ask Americans how they feel about Jews or the Jewish community, they will overwhelmingly say, great. In fact, the Pew Research Group, and Sarah, I know we've talked about this a lot, did a study and where they measured American attitudes towards Jews, and Americans reported overwhelmingly that they felt warmer on a temperature scale towards Jews than actually any other religious minority. I actually think any other religious community, minority or majority. So, when Americans are asked, are you anti-Semitic, or do you harbor these beliefs, or can you even conceive that people would, right? They actually don't. And we get these questions, as you said, all the time, like, what is it with Jews? Why do people have a problem with Jews? Aren't Jews white? Aren't, all of this, like, what, it's just a religion, right? There's this American context. At the same time, we know that hate group actors overwhelmingly target Jews more than any other religious community. Sort of 2/3 to 1/3, 60% of all religiously motivated hate crimes are targeting Jews. And, we know that sort of whiteness, privilege, the privilege that comes with whiteness is, I don't want to say conditional, but as far as, the Jewish history and the Jewish community is concerned, it's sort of baked into our identity and our understanding of the fact that that can be taken away, right? We know that has been the case in the past. So there's this like duality. It's the same way when the ADL measures anti-Semitic attitudes globally, as Mark knows, they don't ask, do you hate Jews? They ask, do you think Jews have too much influence in global, warfare, or are sort of disproportionately controlling global finance, or that they somehow maybe exaggerated the Holocaust, right? So it's hard to identify because, as again, Holocaust historian Deborah Lipstadt says, most anti-Semites don't think of themselves as anti-Semites. And even people who may not, even know that it's in the water in some ways, and it's trafficked in more nuanced ways and in dog whistles. And we should be very clear that the people who are using the dog whistles, the people who originate the dog whistles, and who are sort of creating that language, they know what they're saying, and they're talking to each other through those of us who are sort of passively engaging in that kind of language. So, Mark, what are your thoughts?
I think you're right on target. I was just thinking that I sometimes put it a different way, which is that, and maybe it's a little bit controversial in a sense, but really this is building on some of the work of David Nirenberg or my good friend Robert Vistrick, who called anti-Semitism the longest hatred. And it is that anti-Semitism in a certain way is actually structural to Western society, to Western culture. And it's not just the overt language of anti-Semitism. We don't need Mein Kampf. But if we go back to the origins of Christianity and the way the Catholic Church had to define itself against Jews and Judaism by saying that there was a degenerate people who committed the act of deicide and were then damned forever and dispersed into a diaspora and so on and so forth. I use that 4D mnemonic thing when I teach about this. But that laid a pattern. And that was the way the church had as its vision, and ultimately did not give up to it ultimately until Vatican II in 1963, which I think does not give credit enough to the willingness and it did take the Holocaust to create that environment, but nonetheless, the revolution in thought, in dogma and theology of the Catholic Church from 1963 to today is extraordinary. And I think that we've come to a point where we take it for granted a little bit, not recognizing the effort and the work to root out the anti-Semitism and deal with it while maintaining fidelity to the church's teachings. And as an outsider, as a Jew, I'm just in awe of the effort that it took and what they do with that. Martin Luther came along, and Luther nailed his thesis to the church in Württemberg and stood in opposition. But when Jews did not flock to his following, he came out with a series of, you read it on the Jews and their lies in the 16th century, 400 years before the Nazis came to power. He was talking about burning Jewish books and stripping Jews of their rights and so on and so forth, exiling them. It's scary to read what he said, and we don't do these simplistic lines of cause and effect, but it does give you pause to thought that this was a German theologian who had an enormous impact in Germany, saying these things 400 years that were enacted 400 years later. And of course, social Darwinism and racial science that came along, and the Enlightenment and the strength, all these were built in. So there's this whole structure, and it wasn't just verbal or literary or theological. It was literally, of course, from Chaucer to T.S. Eliot, for example, in just an English language, had anti-Semitism in there. But I'm struck by, a couple of years ago, there was that terrible fire in the Cathedral of Notre Dame I think it was July 2 years ago, where everybody or most people were transfixed at this glorious monument to religion and inspirational structure in Western society, and symbol of Paris and France was threatened by fire. And yet, if you look closely at that, I don't know how many people realize that over the lintels of one of the doors, there were the two statues, the traditional statues of Ecclesia and Synagogue, the church and the synagogue. And the church is triumphant, upright, victorious, and blessed, and the synagogue is blinded, slumped over with a broken staff, and eternally cursed. So even if you were illiterate, you would pick up these messages unconsciously throughout anyone who was just alive, basically, over the past millennia of Western society. And we haven't, I think, dealt with that adequately enough. We haven't realized that these, as you call it, unconscious messages are still there. The fact that we have to continuously define ourselves in certain ways against the majority culture that we live in is telling. It's not necessarily the matter of our skin, but that we still have to define ourselves, and we still have to sometimes say, there was a congresswoman sitting in Congress who once again came up with the charge that Jews perhaps worshipped other masters than had, than were being good citizens in the United States. This was not an ancient charge. This was a fairly recent charge. So we still have this problem of being seen as the other. And that is a huge issue that I think we have to deal with. And that's why I think one of the things that I've worked on is this definition of anti-Semitism, because it creates a common baseline. But it's not just a description of what anti-Semitism is, but we included a series of examples to go along with it, which kind of picks up what you were saying about the ADL questions. And we say very clearly in it that its context matters. You can have the same theme, let's say, appear in two different contexts. And in one case, it's problematic. and in one case it's not. So there's no blind checkoff that, I mean, obviously someone walking around with a swastika, but we're talking about something more sophisticated. And I'm just going to give, this was kind of one of the answers I was thinking about, that was raised before, but I'm going to throw it out now because I don't know how much time we have left. And I want to get to it. 2 concrete examples of why it's necessary to have some kind of baseline idea of what anti-Semitism is. There's a synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany, in the summer of 2014, in the middle of the whole uprest disturbance and sunrise in Gaza, that was firebombed with Jews in it. Fortunately, no one was hurt. The perpetrators were arrested. Turned out they were Middle Eastern origin, and they were obviously anti-Zionist, anti-Israel. I should say obviously, but that was what they said. And a German court, upheld by a German appeals court, that said this was not a hate crime, but throwing a Molotov cocktail at a synagogue was an act of political protest. What the 5 Jews in Wuppertal had to do with the Israeli government decision or actions in Gaza is totally unclear to me, but the German court system, in its wisdom, ruled that case that way. We don't have to stay in 2014. We can go just to the events of last week in Paris, where a high court found the murderer of a elderly Jewish woman, Sarah Halimi, to be unfit to stand trial because he was high on weed, he claimed in his defense, when he committed her murder. Of course, he also shouted radical Islam slogans and talked about getting out to get a Jew, but none of that mattered. This is the same court system that sentenced and imprisoned a man for throwing a dog off a balcony, but refused to act against the murder of a Jewish woman. Yes, there are outrages and protests and demonstrations throughout Paris, throughout Europe, throughout the United States. And even the president of France, to his credit, Emmanuel Macron, came out against the verdict and so on and so forth. But it shows that in certain circles, anti-Semitism does still not play out as a recognized factor in society, and Jews become open targets, essentially, because of that. And that is what we're trying to avoid. And we're trying to, the same way that anti-Semitism is globalized, as I pointed earlier, action against anti-Semitism begins on the local level, cannot succeed without local participation and grassroots participation. But it also, if you're going to really work on the problem structurally, institutionally, whatever, requires globalization in your answer as well. You have to have some kind of common basis and understanding of what anti-Semitism is to begin to tackle the issue. So I'll stop with that.
So we're gonna dive in. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. The last question I'm gonna ask both of you is really 2 parts. One is, what can we do? We're finally getting to that place. And Mark, you just laid out one of the things I think that's important, that we have a definition and a way to recognize this together. But what can we do? What are ways that we can counter anti-Semitism, counter these trends, and maybe what gives you hope in what you're seeing in the world today? Either of you want to go first?
Sure, I'll take a first stab, and then Mark can close us out with, I'm sure, what will be wise words. So, I was giving this question some thought earlier, and I think picking up where Mark left off with the definition, we have to focus on education. We have to start, I think particularly in America, as Jews, I think we're way behind actually in helping, frankly, our own community develop language to build allies in this space and to articulate, what's at play in this moment as it relates to anti-Semitism. I'm going back to the language in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. I mean, I got as many questions outside the Jewish community as I did inside the Jewish community about, like, why were they saying that? And so I think there's been some fear, and certainly understandably, this is the balance we always try and strike, when we think about explaining some of these crazy conspiracy theory, hateful ideas, right? But I don't think we have the luxury at this point of simply just like staying quiet about this and hoping that it goes away. It's migrating, as we've said, I think relatively quickly towards the center of our society from the fringes. And so we really need to be proactive about educating. And in Cincinnati, we've really been focused on that over the last couple of years. 2 years ago, we hosted a summit on anti-Semitism and hate, or rather on how to combat it, where we really worked across the community with diverse groups who are targets of hatred to host this. And we focused on drawing those connections, helping people understand that you really can't fight anti-Semitism without fighting other forms of hatred and without working to strengthen our democracy. And so, we had breakout sessions where we had experts from different communities talking about sort of the commonalities. And I think it's also important that we, as you said, Sarah, that we help people understand the particularities of anti-Semitism. The fact that yes, it is there are commonalities. It is a form of prejudice. It is something that operates in some ways similar to other hatreds, but in many ways it is different. It has a different flavor, and it's again functioning much more like a conspiracy theory. So it may not be something that's as obvious to many people as in America we understand some of the ideology of racism to be, right? I mean, not to say in any way that all racism is obvious and that we've gotten rid of that problem, because certainly we all know we have not. But I think that the ideology of racism is something that's really understood more widely understood in America than the ideology of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism doesn't fit cleanly into sort of what marginalization looks like in America and what we know that to be. But I think, we're working now to really build out allies and alliances with other communities. We're launching this program right now called Leaders in Light, which is sort of an outgrowth of the summit that we hosted, where we're going to be we're recruiting right now some of our top civic leaders in Cincinnati across different spectrums of diversity, from political persuasion to background to profession, to come together to really do a deep dive study over the course of 9 months with different sort of scholars in residence every month on the themes of extremism and democracy, the common roots of extremism and hatred, the role that anti-Semitism plays in this. And, we're not just stopping with education, we're actually empowering this group of leaders to do work in their communities on these topics and to combat these things. And, with resources, mentorship and funding to be able to actually turn the learning into action. And so I'll wrap it into sort of what leaves me feeling hopeful. And in this moment, today I was just kind of going through where we are in recruitment for this cohort. And, right after, I would say after Tree of Life and even after Poway, there was this sinking sort of fear I had that, if your house is burning down and no one else sees the fire but you're really in trouble. Right? The first step is actually just acknowledging that there's a house that's on fire. And the recruitment that we have been able to do for this program, where, anti-Semitism is a part of it, where, again, we're highlighting the linkages between some of these things. I came ready to do so much explaining in sort of the recruitment for this, to help people understand that this is why the Jewish community is hosting this. This is why we're doing sort of a focus on anti-Semitism. And I found that overwhelmingly, most of the people I'm talking to say, yeah, I totally understand. So in some ways it's a bad thing that this is so become more obvious and clear to people. But in some ways, at least there is some acknowledgement that this is a problem that we all have to join together and deal with together. And I think we're really starting to see that. So that's what leaves me hopeful, that I think we're in a much better place to combat it than we were several years ago.
Thanks, Jackie. Mark, we just have a couple minutes left, unfortunately.
Okay, I mean, there are a couple of thoughts that come to mind. First of all is, Jackie spoke a lot about allies, and I think it's obviously very important, not just on the national or municipal level, but certainly on the international level as well. I think that part of it is recognizing that anti-Semitism is distinct as all forms of racism are distinct to the people who suffer from it. But they also have distinctive factors and based on historical conditions and so on. Won't go into that now. But at the same time, we have to recognize, for example, I actually think that if there was going to be mass violence aimed at a minority in the United States, Jews would not be the first target, because the historical precedent was set in Europe. Yes, Jews would probably be the first target. They were the first target, the greatest target. Here, the targets would be Native Americans, people of color, because they've suffered that already on a mass level. And once something happens historically, it's much easier to do it and repeat it a second or third time. So there's recognition that we're all in this boat together in a certain way. I think that the issue really is realizing the depth of the problem, not gliding over it, acknowledging it, but acknowledging it in a productive manner. We see today so many people in our political leadership, in our communal leadership, who, to use the phrase, weaponize anti-Semitism or any other issue that you wish, and use it to score political points at their enemies, at their targets. They can't debate, they just want to delegitimize. That is not only not helpful, not constructive, it's destructive. It desensitizes people to the issue, to the reality of what's going on there, and it makes people turn away from trying to find a solution to basically just turning off instead. As a first step, I'm going to say we have to stop weaponizing anti-Semitism. And this goes on the right, on the left, in the Jewish community, outside of the Jewish community. It should go for any form of racism or bigotry or intolerance. But since this is our topic today, I'll be very specific about that. So that is, I think, one of the most important lessons we can get. Secondly, is to know, again, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. We have to know the social conditions that create it currently, but also the history from where it comes. Because anti-Semitism feeds on its history. It mutates, it takes new forms, but they encapsulate old themes. And we can't ignore that. We need to know that as well. We also can't let anti-Semitism define us. We as Jews do not live as Jews because of a negative of not, showing anti-Semites that they're winning or whatever. We should be living as Jews and emphasizing the positive aspects of Jewish life. However you define your Jewish identity, it's got to be a positive, not a negative. And I think that's crucially important to move forward with as well. In terms of, I mentioned allies before, I'm extraordinarily encouraged by the fact that there are so many people involved in this effort who are not Jewish. And if I look at the EU, for example, which has been on board in all sorts of ways, if I look at the fact that there are at least 7 countries now that have specific envoys or ambassadors assigned to monitoring and combating anti-Semitism outside of the United States, where we were one of the first to do that, but they have specific roles within their government for these people. If I look at the United Nations, which now has a focal point, the former foreign minister of Spain, Morentinos, who was designated by the Secretary General to be the focal point on anti-Semitism, to deal with it, not just on a superficial level, but also actually to look at the UN itself, which has had many issues regarding anti-Semitism. His mandate is to look internally, not just to comment externally. I think that is extraordinarily important signposts. Speaking of the UN, they appointed their special rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief, a Muslim named Dr. Ahmed Shahid, to do a report a year ago. It was given to the General Assembly a year ago, September. And in it, Shahid wrote, and I think these were extraordinarily on-point words, right on target. And he said, anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy. He knew exactly what he was writing. I think that is a phrase that ever since he said it to me, and then I saw it written, and then I've been using it ever since, because I think it sums up the problem. Anti-Semitism is not an issue only for Jews. It is toxic for democracy. The anti-Semites in today's world, and we didn't get to discuss this, the people who not just deny the Holocaust, because those are on the fringes, those are, the David Irvings that no one listens to, but the Holocaust distorters who manipulate and whitewash and propagandize around the Holocaust, what they're trying to do is undermine the structures of Western liberal democracy that have grown up since the Holocaust. The UN, the EU, the concepts of civil rights, of war crimes, of human rights, of accountability, and so on, that have shaped our society and have been imperfect, because we've had genocides in Rwanda, the Balkans, and other places like that, but have kept the world from erupting the way it had previously, those are their targets. And anti-Semitism is a tool to destabilize those targets as well. So we have to realize that larger picture. And so ultimately, I'll end with one concrete example because I know we're running out of time. What encourages me the most, and this may surprise everybody given everything we know about politics in the United States today, lies actually in Washington, in the Capitol itself, where senators and congressmen in both houses, in the Senate led by Jackie Rosen and Jim Lankford, in the House by Ted Deutsch and Chris Smith, Democrats and Republicans have come together to form bipartisan task force on anti-Semitism. They may have absolutely nothing else that they will agree on, which in Washington today is probably the norm, but this issue has brought them together. I think that's an extraordinarily powerful statement of what our leadership can do and should do. And I think that if we begin by looking, again, left at left, right at right anti-Semitism, left at left anti-Semitism, and follow the bipartisan leadership that is being modeled in Washington and through IRA, which is 34 countries, majority of which are not Jewish delegates there, we see the potential for collaborative work that could have a really positive impact on anti-Semitism in the mainstream, as Jackie said, not just the extremes, but also serve hopefully as a model to dealing with other forms of racism and intolerance moving forward.
So on that note, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jackie, for all of the background and context and information and leaving us on a hopeful note. We'll take that light and pass it on to the 21st hour of this global vigil. And may our work and words carry this forward. Thank you both. And I will turn it over to the next hour. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.